Hello, everyone. Welcome to another stream. It's Wednesday, October 8th. My name is Mike. If you are here for the first time, I'm Mike. I use they and he pronouns. I was an additional designer on the Daggerheart core rulebook. I was also the lead designer of Marauders of Windfall, which was an adventure that was published last year during the open beta. And I was a co-writer of the Daggerheart homebrew kit, as well as an additional designer on the Quick Start adventure, also known as the Sablewood Messengers. So I've done a lot of Daggerheart stuff. I do Daggerheart compatible design on these streams a lot. I talk about running and playing the game, and today we're going to talk about creating and running kind of adventure modules or written adventures for Daggerheart. I am working on a adventure to be used with the Daggerheart rules. I'm going to share some material from that adventure during this stream today, and I want to talk more broadly about kind of how I think about and approach writing adventures for this game, specifically because of where I see it fitting in terms of how much it is calling for or encouraging improvisation and player agency, and the ways that that can challenge some traditional ideas about adventure design as I see them. I do not use a lot of written adventures when I'm GMing, but I have read a number of them and I've played a number of them, including I played a full campaign of Dungeons of Drakkenheim, which is one of the factors that helped lead me to my new project, which I will talk about just in brief, working as lead designer on the new version of Dungeons of Drakkenheim for Daggerheart in a partnership between the Dungeon Dudes, Ghostfire Gaming, and Darrington Press. Hello, Pathfinder PhD. You are not too late. Thank you. I am very excited about the news being out. I've been working on this for a little while, and it's been a ton of fun so far. Getting to talk with and collaborate with the Dungeon Dudes has been an absolute delight, and it's been really fun to see how strong and positive the response to the announcement has been so far. I want to say hello, welcome, and thank you to Vida Bjornen, who followed and recently subscribed with Prime and resubscribed with Prime. So thank you so much for joining today, and I'm really glad to hear that the videos that I've been making have been useful for you. I would love to hear any little bits about your homebrew campaign that you're happy to share throughout this conversation. I like to hear how people are doing and about people's games, in little bits here, though I don't want to kind of take the whole stream into that level of back and forth, because I have a specific plan for this stream today, though I will be doing more like patron and subscriber direct streams, probably one toward the end of this month or early next month. I am pretty busy right now with the Drakkenheim stuff, but I am going to do my best to balance between the freelance work and still giving a steady supply of cool, exclusive, and preview material to supporters. I'm happy to take a brief look at something like that, Vita Bjornen. If you want to just type a little bit about it and share in the chat, that is also fine. But if you'd rather just kind of share it directly with me, you're welcome to send me a whisper or a DM on Patreon if you're on there as well. And I'll try to make some time to look at it and figure out how, if there's stuff you want to talk about. I try to make myself be a resource for folks where I can, to the extent of my availability. I try not to overschedule myself, because what I do is I get excited about a lot of things. I take on a bunch of things, and then I overextend and either have to pull back on things or I crash and have to pull back on things. So I'm trying to avoid the crashing part. But it's balancing that with wanting to support people. Anyway, as we can see here, this video is not official content of Darrington Press or Critical Role. I am speaking just for myself in this in this regard, sharing my opinions about and experiences with Daggerheart the game. I'm only going to touch very briefly on the Drakkenheim stuff because we're still in pre-launch and I'm letting Ghostfire kind of take the lead on promotional stuff there. But if you have very basic questions that have already been answered, I can share those answers. I am talking with the Ghostfire folks about other things I can do to support the campaign, but nothing that has been settled and announced just yet. So here we're going to jump over to, boom, my notes. And by notes, I mean this is literally the document for my work in progress adventure. I have added a few things for the stream that I want to make sure to talk about, but then this is just a almost 7,000 word Word document that is my working draft for the adventure, which I'm currently calling Voice of the Swarm. This is a adventure to be used with the Daggerheart rules, specifically with the Witherwild campaign frame. The Witherwild campaign frame is one of the ones in the core book, and most importantly for this exercise, it is in the Daggerheart SRD, which means that it is available to create kind of third-party material for and sell that material. I was not a credited designer on the Witherwild. That is created by Carlos Cisco, Rowan Hall, and Spencer Stark, who are all lovely, wonderful people that I greatly enjoyed working with. But I really like the Witherwild. Some of its touchstones are some of my favorite pieces of media. Mononoke Hime, or Princess Mononoke, is one of my favorite Studio Ghibli films. And in a past life, this is before you were a weeb. Before you were a weeb, you were an otaku, if you were a Westerner who was super into Japanese cultural stuff. So that was me in junior high and high school, and to a certain degree in college, though. The thing about college is studying at a higher intensity will necessarily round out your experience with something, and so I became less... my interest was more contextualized with like a historical understanding and, a bit more maturity and stuff like that. So I'm going to read Vita Bjornen's note real quick. Isekai for high school kids. So they end up in Forgotten Realms, and then some Crystals of Power, Doctor Who. Well, this sounds like an absolute delight, Vita Bjornen. There were some campaigns that I ran that did that kind of smushing together several things, because why not? Nobody's going to come and get you. And I like the idea of isekai to Forgotten Realms, especially for people who know that setting pretty well, because then you're going to get to poke at or go and explore parts of the setting that you really like. So that is very fun. And then anytime you can add timey-wimey stuff, that is going to create some great opportunities. I've only watched a little bit of the kind of new era of Doctor Who, right, from Eccleston through some of Tennant, and then little bits and pieces since then. But thank you so much for sharing. In doing adventures for Daggerheart, the core tension or question that I return to when I'm thinking about developing a module or adventure or something like that for use with the Daggerheart rules is a balance between flexibility and structure, right here. In something like, the book is underneath several other things, right? The Dungeons of Drakkenheim guide, campaign guide for Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, right, is like 300 something pages. In 5e and in Pathfinder and in a number of other role-playing games, the multi-hundred page campaign book is a fairly established format. There's a lot of variation in how to deliver material on that scale, but the idea that you get a big book and that's an adventure that you can play for months, if not years, that is a known thing in tabletop role-playing games, right? D&D adventures in the 70s and 80s and some into the 90s were more modular, right? Which is part of why sometimes you'll hear people say module instead of adventure. Sometimes I do as well. So they were smaller bits that made it easier to be like, okay, well, this week we're going to play this thing, and then next week, if one player is gone and we have a different player, we're going to play something else, right? You have that flexibility. The larger adventure books are less modular like that, though some of them are that have more flexibility in structure. One of the reasons that I think Dungeons & Drachenheim makes a good match for Daggerheart is that it has a lot of flexibility and room for players to kind of make big choices, both in how they approach things, what they do in major situations, and which locations they approach in what order. That kind of requires a somewhat different presentation of material versus a really thoroughly linear adventure module, right? If something is meant to be experienced in a more linear fashion, even if there are choices along the way, right, you're going to end up with something that's kind of, in interactive fiction design gets talked about as diamond design. The idea being that you start at a particular point and then you have several choices and you write what happens and how you follow through on those choices. But then usually you end up back at a nexus point so that you start at one particular point. You have variety and options for several different things. So the options widen, but then they come back together again so that you make a diamond shape. And the reason that you do that is if you don't come back together, you're going to end up with endlessly multiplying varieties and like different sections that you need to write. In interactive fiction, video game kind of stuff, in a TTRPG, you don't necessarily have to write out every scene, but if you're trying to provide structure, you're going to want to give some structure or guidance for each of those major like beats or variations or points of divergence. And so having a structure that brings things back together or ties things back together or has like a hub and spoke structure can be really useful for constraining scope so that you don't end up with that endlessly multiplying options kind of a situation. I'm just going to mute here while I take a drink. So that's the big first thing that I think about when I'm approaching adventure writing for Daggerheart. In the other adventures that I worked on that are already published, whether that's Marauders of Windfall, published in a beta form, or the Quick Start adventure, which has been updated for the final rules, right? I'm working with a team to varying degrees, and each of those adventures was written with particular objectives, right? I, as a freelancer, was given a brief. I write to fulfill that brief to the best of my ability, and then it's used by the company in the way that they want to or that they have kind of made a plan to. When doing something on my own, I get to figure out what do I want this adventure to do? Who do I want this to be for? What do I want it to explore? What ways and what places do I want to try to break new ground or iterate on what has come before? And the biggest thing that I have been developing that I want to try to present and bring to the Daggerheart creator communities is a approach for writing adventures such that these adventures can be tailored to the player characters and feel like they are adventures about those characters more than they are adventures that these player characters participate in. The idea being that for me in Daggerheart, the player characters are the main characters of the overall story, and if any given adventure also supports and it resonates with these characters' story arcs, personalities, motivations, and things like that, those adventures are going to be more emotionally impactful for the players, and I think the overall group is going to enjoy using or building on these adventures as a part of the broader story, because the adventure is flexible or adjustable so that the characters can fit to the adventure and the adventure can be made to fit to the characters. In my Patreon posts previously, I've talked about this as made to measure design, basically using a like a crafting tailoring metaphor. I am leaving that one behind for something that I think is a little bit more intelligible for a science fiction fantasy RPG audience, which is the idea of archetype design. And I'm going to talk about archetypes in this adventure in just a few minutes. But to give you a rough introduction, I'm going to go ahead and actually just borrow from myself, because I wrote a thing about using archetypes, and I'm going to go ahead and just use my own wording instead of trying to recompose it on the spot. Yeah, Pathfinder PhD says, I love the idea, as Derek from Knights of the Last Call references, draw maps, leave blanks, right? This is a common refrain in a particular set of legacies or lineages of specifically narrative game design. And I think it shows up in some other things because the influences spread really broadly. For me, what draw maps, leave blanks means for adventure design is you figure out how much support do you need to give, how much material do you need, so that GMs and playgroups can take what is there, make it their own, and add to it so that they feel like the story is specific to them. In adventures, that maybe works a little bit differently than if we were just looking at how a campaign frame works, for instance, things like that, right? I think an adventure is going to provide more detail than a campaign frame, but in a really zoomed in way, whereas a campaign frame gives an overall kind of pitch or provides kind of broader setting information, whereas a individual adventure, right, you're going to want more specifics, more stuff that's on the ground, more about individual locations, individual character motivation, and things like that. So, adventure archetypes. What I have written. This is a rough draft, so if there's like spelling errors or grammatical mess ups, then like don't at me, please. In order to help your group make this adventure your own, Voice of the Swarm presents 4 character archetypes that PCs can fill in order to help the process of making the adventure feel specific and personal to the party. Specific and personal. Specific being you fit this situation, right? This is not, you're not just any characters. You are people for whom the stakes of this story matter. You are going to buy in to what is happening. You are not just any random passerby. You are people who have reason to engage with this material because of motivation. And personal being that you're going to have pre-existing connections to NPCs in the adventure that the player and the GM can develop together. The action of the adventure is going to matter to the individuals, not just because it is the challenge that is being presented to the group, but because what is happening is going to matter emotionally and have a personal investment for the individual characters, right? It's specific and personal is kind of, there's a lot of overlap, but I'm trying to gesture towards something that's a little bit broader. Since this is a level 1 or tier 1 adventure, it's easiest to do this process of selecting archetypes in session 0 so that players know what's expected of them and can incorporate those archetypes into their character creation process. What will be more difficult, I think, is using archetype design or using tools or presenting prompts to personalize and adjust an adventure to characters when it's like tier 2, tier 3, tier 4. and the player characters were not created to be able to fit that adventure, but the group wants to use it. And then the work of adjusting it is either in curation for the GM of this adventure I think has enough good hooks for my party that I can make it work in Daggerheart. Or it's a process of writing an adventure that has enough kind of on-ramps or enough open seams or hooks that it can be useful to a wide range of parties. So one part of that is on the group, and another part of that is on the designer, right? I can only do the designer's part if I am writing something and putting it out into the world. If I write something and then I run it myself, I can also do some of that other side of the work. But if I'm releasing something to be a commercial product, I can't be at that table with everybody. So I have to do my very best on the design side to be clear about what I am presenting so that the group doesn't go in and be like, oh, well, I thought there were going to be a lot of like pirate adventures in this. So I thought it would be cool for my pirate character, but we actually never go on boats except in the river once, right? Like that's no good. So you want to be clear in your presentation and your positioning of this is a pirate themed adventure, or this is a nautical adventure where you are caught between a group of pirates and, a Royal Navy. If I present an adventure in that fashion, I'm implicitly, if not explicitly, saying if you have a pirate character, they're going to kind of be at home in this, and there should be lots of options for them to feel like they belong here and they can connect with and invest in what is happening, and there are going to be opportunities for them to be in the spotlight and really get to shine as a pirate character. So I have an attempt at box text here of how I'm going to present this so that I'm writing the adventure for the GM, and then the GM can read this text to their party. And this says, since Daggerheart is a game for telling character-focused stories with shared narrative authority, this adventure presents 4 archetypes to help us make this adventure feel specific and personal to the party. I'll ask the questions below, and players should try to fill at least 2 of these archetypes by providing a response to the questions. And the group, this is not 2 archetypes per character, this is at least 2 for the whole group. I'd rather do 3, but I haven't decided how much do I want to demand of the party in a presentation of an adventure. If I have 4 archetypes and they fill 2, is that going to be enough? This is part of why this is a work in progress, is that I'm both iterating on my idea of archetype-oriented design, and I am exploring how I want to approach Daggerheart-specific adventure writing. So I'm sharing something that is very much in flux here. The idea is that I'm going to toss out hooks and prompts, and then if someone takes it, I tell them what the archetype they are going to occupy, or they're going to take on, or kind of fill this archetype. Which one of you has lived in the town for a time in the town of Greymire, known for its fecund peat bog? You are the local, right? Somebody who lived here and has a connection based on lived experience in the space. Which one of you was trained in the rites of supplication to appease the faint divinities? You are the speaker. This is going to be probably druids, possibly warlocks, right? People are using stuff from the void. Warlocks or witches are all pretty good candidates for maybe knowing some of the magic to appease faint divinities, but it's not necessarily only them, right? I'm not saying for druids, rangers, and witches. I'm saying here's a prompt, question, or a hook in general. And then that character is the speaker. And in the adventure, I'm going to call out places where a character who knows how to appease or supplicate the faint divinities is going to get to fill in some detail or add some information, establish some world building, or is the character who is likely to be called upon or hailed in some regard because of the knowledge that they have. Which one of you has made a practice of studying and confronting the dangerous beasts of the Witherwild? You are the hunter, right? There's going to be some fighting monsters and dealing with how the Witherwild affects nature more specifically, right? So a character could theoretically be both the speaker and the hunter, but in a larger party, I would recommend and guide a group toward having each character take on an archetype before one character takes on several archetypes, especially if there's a smaller number of archetypes. Because if you have a group of 5 and then one character has 2 archetypes, another has 1, and then 3 of them have no archetypes, the GM is going to have to work harder to find places to more strongly tie those characters into the adventure and to give them spotlight. Vita Bjornen has redeemed some points to hydrate, so I'm going to mute again and take a drink of water. And lastly, which one of you comes from Haven or lived in Haven and knows people in the army? You are the associate, right? The associate of somebody from Haven. Part of the trick here is that the Haven army is occupying the town of Greymire. And so this town is exemplifying and manifesting one of the core tensions in the Witherwild campaign frame, which is Fainwick versus Haven, where people in Haven are suffering from the serpent sickness, this magical petrifying disease, and Haven is trying to address this disease by growing a bunch of a flower called Lady's Veil, where 1 in 10,000 Lady's Veils generates a red flower, and only the red flowers can generate cures. Thing is, Lady's Veil only grows in Fainwick. So Haven invaded Fainwick and has been forcing the people of Fainwick to grow a bunch of Lady's Veil to create cures. Greymire is one such town. It used to be a peat bog farming town, right, where they would harvest peat and then use it for chemistry and alchemy and stuff like that, and, you know, just as heating. And Haven has made them fill in the bog and turned them into Lady's Veil fields. So there's an active military occupation in the town of Greymire, and then this other stuff is happening. So I have some options here, right? If no player selects the local, look at alternative hooks. Basically, here's some extra ideas on how you might be able to connect a character to the adventure. And then these are archetype background questions, kind of extra background questions per character archetype to help give those players the option to add to the world building and take a little bit more ownership of this part of the setting, in addition to giving them some context of how they're connected to this place or to the story overall. And then I have a system for alternative hooks, right? If you don't want to fit the archetypes, here's some options for the GM. These are more traditional hooks versus the idea of a player saying, yes, I'm happy to buy in to make my character this specific kind of character, or to add or adjust something for my character so that they fit this thing. That's how I'm approaching it right now. I'm going to scroll back to the top real quick so I can give you the overall pitch for this adventure in specific. So if quick scrolling is going to be a problem for you, maybe avert your eyes for just a few moments. Okay. So the pitch: plagued by swarms that have devastated their granaries and storehouses, the town of Greymire calls for aid. They seek a group brave enough to travel into the wilderness to the overgrown shrine of Yitrax to make an offering and beg forgiveness. Yitrax is the voice of the swarm, one of the faint divinities. They use they-them pronouns. They govern pests and insects that eat/pollute dry goods used by humanoids, right? It's a really specific subsection of animals, mostly insects. The idea here being that Yetrax would receive offerings and then manifest their control over these animals to have those animals not infest the larders and granaries of mortals, and instead they would eat these offerings, right? Please don't mess up our food, but we're going to provide for you in this separate way, right? So that you can live where you are and we can live where we are. And for a long time, there was balance. As long as the offerings were being made, Yetrax would keep to this compact made between mortals and the divinity. But here's the thing. Two big problems. One, Haven invaded, and now they control the town and tell people what to do, even though the Havenites mostly don't know Wickling or Fainwick culture and their like political and magical agreements. And two, the Witherwild has made traveling outside of settlements extremely dangerous. And so the journey to the shrine, which would have only taken a couple of hours before the Witherwild, is now dangerous enough that it takes most people more than a day to get there. And so that shrine has not been attended to, and the offerings have not been made. And so Yetrax has withdrawn that protection, and now the town is also being kind of infested or attacked by these waves of swarming insects who are hungry and trying to find food. So we have a town that has been invaded, occupied, forced to do terraforming, change their entire local industry, and is being hounded by these magically driven insects because of their failure to keep an agreement with one of the faint divinities. So the player characters come into a big mess. My goal with this is that if there's more than one conflict, or if the conflicts are interconnected, then it makes the situation it gives it more dimension and more dimensions, right? 3 dimensions instead of 1 or 2 dimensions, because the Haven occupation is part of why the people of Greymire haven't been able to tend to or make sacrifices to Yetrax. Yetrax sending swarms means that the Havenites are on like an itchy trigger finger and are cracking down and taking more direct control over the town in order to protect everyone from these invading swarms. The people of the town want the Havenites away, and they want to be able to appease Yetrax, but doing one without addressing the other is very hard because they are not allowed free movement through the region by the Havenites. And so they can't go and tend to the shrine easily. And if they can't tend to the shrine, then the town is getting screwed over, and the military is going to maintain this kind of higher level of control and war footing. That premise of this type of divinity who has this kind of relationship with the town, and then the major complications that make it so that what used to be a fairly viable status quo over generations and generations between Greymire and people in the region and Yetrax, voice of the swarm, one of these many faint divinities, is that all of that has broken down, right? That the different tensions and major problems in the setting of the Witherwild are instantiated and manifest here in the town of Greymire. The Witherwild matters in Greymire. Haven is here because of the serpent sickness. They are forcing the people here to grow Lady's Veil, which then again ties back to serpent sickness and is only viable in the way that it is because of the Witherwild. The Witherwild is affecting and destabilizing the relationship between mortals and the faint divinities, as is manifest in the broken agreement between Yetrax and the people of Greymire. So I'm trying to hit the big themes and manifest some of the distinctions of the campaign frame so that this is a good adventure for people to play at level 1/tier 1 and have it feel like it is Witherwildy, right? It's my interpretation of the Witherwild, drawing on some of the ways that the kind of divinities are related to in particular religious communities and traditions, right? There's some notable influence here from Shinto because Princess Mononoke and Nausicaä of the Valley of the Wind are major touchstones for this setting. And so my interpretation of the Witherwild is to bring some of that cultural context to how the faint divinities and mortals relate to each other. I'm trying to pull it a little bit away from just being, this is just fantasy Shinto, without decontextualizing things that are very thoroughly Japanese. And I only feel comfortable attempting to do that because I have this academic background. And before I publish this, I want to get it in the hands of some folks who are Japanese or in the Japanese diaspora and can give me cultural consultation on like, hey, Mike, actually, this part doesn't work like you think it does, and it would be XYZ, or you don't want to talk about it this way because something, 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 right? Even though I have an academic background, that doesn't mean that I have the same level of lived experience that other people do. So that is a kind of a built-in challenge that I know I'm going to want to address through expanding my team and getting feedback from people who are better able to answer the question of how well does this draw from Japanese cultural traditions respectfully, right? Does it do so respectfully? Are there things that I should not do or things that I should change? When you're doing like secondary world fantasy, or really when you're doing any number of things, if you are drawing more directly on cultures that are not your own, there is the potential to replicate stereotypes, kind of reduce people or reduce ideas to caricature, and to perpetuate kind of bad or harmful beliefs about a group. And I don't want to do that. So, right, I'm doing the best that I can. This is a work in progress, and then I'm going to get some more feedback. And that is just like a general writing thing, right? I've worked with cultural consultants before on other projects that I have reached out to and paid for their time and their input on projects, right? The Daggerheart book had cultural consultants. Other RPG folks are doing that as well. So, some key elements that I'm currently utilizing in how I approach this adventure. This is going to be more overview than in-depth breakdown of the whole adventure because the adventure isn't done yet. I have my act-by-act breakdown, which is as much an outline to myself as anything else, really. I've written down some key NPCs. I'm going to have more NPC write-ups later in the document, so it's not just the one NPC Yi-Trax. So here is the archetype stuff again. Right, I'm opening with some box text, and then I go right into a paint the scene prompt. I have talked often of paint the scene, I think, across these different videos, but I am very fond of paint the scene, and whenever I reference it, I want to make sure to give credit to Jason Cordova, who is the creator of this framework. The paint the scene prompt here is, how can you tell these soldiers kind of out in the fields are not here to protect the townsfolk from the Witherwild, but to keep them in line, right? The player characters come across these huge Ladies' Vale fields where people from Greymire are being supervised / guarded by Haven soldiers. And the thing that I want to hit with this moment is, what's the real relationship between Haven and the people of Greymire? It is not that Haven is protecting them. It is that Haven is coercing them into particular behaviors specifically growing a bunch of Lady's Veil to create cures for the people of Haven. Instead of just saying that outright, the paint the scene prompt, as I'm trying to deploy it here, brings the players in on the reality of the situation and says, let's all talk about how this works, right? Let's paint the scene, fill out the scene and descriptions so that it is clear to the audience in the moment, which is also us, but a hypothetical external audience, what is really going on here. And instead of me just saying or telling the GM, explain how things are to the players, the GM brings them into the circle of trust and says, okay, we're all going to exemplify and display why things are this way and how things are this way, which is part of why I really like paint the scene prompts. They have that bringing people into trust element, but they also, part of that is asking the players to make these contributions, but giving them really clear and narrow guidelines, right? Not just what do you see or what are these soldiers like? How can you tell that these soldiers are not here to protect the townsfolk from the Witherwild, but to keep them in line? The narrower the prompt, hopefully the less broadly the player has to think, because they've already been given a lot of guidance, right? It's the idea that jazz thrives with constraints, that if you ask a totally open-ended prompt, there's an infinite number of possibilities, and that can be kind of intellectually paralyzing or intellectually demobilizing for somebody. It's overwhelming because there's too many options. If you narrow the options, you add constraints, that can be easier for a lot of people to engage with because they can just narrow their thinking to fit the constraint or the prompt that has been given. So the next thing that I'm going to talk about is using environments. I think environments are great. I have talked about this a lot. Presenting environments as kind of the backbone for an encounter or a scene gives the GM kind of a menu of, here are some of the moves that you can utilize in this kind of a scene, right? If the player characters are being interrogated at the gate of a town, well, here's some things to know, right? The gate won't be opened unless the officer of the watch is satisfied with the party's answers. Here's some mechanics you can use to track that. And here's some things you might do based on what happens, right? Proceed to the section marked, go about your business. That's a adventure header past the environment, right? So the environment is providing resources and some guidance, but it's also giving a little bit of the roadmap of, cool, if you hit this, or if this happens during the scene because I'm a group of resources for this scene, here's where you go, or here's what happens. An environment will also tell you kind of what are the rules of this moment or this situation, right? You can get an advantage by proving that they are a member in the military or bureaucracy, or by displaying a chunk of food to be offered to the soldiers as a gift, aka a bribe, right? These are guards, you can bribe them. What else will they respond to? They'll respond to authority or to something else that signifies belonging. In a scene like this, you can press the button that is, hey, I'm going to introduce the fact that a bunch of swarms are attacking the town. If the scene is really going very smoothly and you want to add complication, you can introduce that there. If things are going really poorly and the player characters are being chased, you might introduce the swarms to either give them a common enemy or maybe give the player characters cover for escaping. They still haven't gotten into the town, but maybe you don't need to end up with a situation where the player characters are captured and are thrown in the brig, because maybe you don't want to do that, or maybe the players don't want to do that. And if things escalate, the soldiers can just start shooting. And then I've got a note Havenite hospitality, which is basically, it's not hospitality. They're being mean. Each of these features has some prompt questions, as is standard for environments. When included in a adventure, these are written not to be flexible, where the environment is used in 100 different situations. I'm trying to be more specific to what will help this scene, which I, as the writer of the adventure, am hoping to do these specific things. One of my goals is to adjust or push some of these prompts toward specific character archetypes, right? What does the speaker do in this situation? What does the hunter notice? So that's something that I have in mind. I've been working on other stuff, so I haven't been back to this as much lately. But as my thinking about adventure design for Daggerheart compatible adventures continues to evolve, right, these are the things that are on my mind, and so I want to share that. Thank you to Vita Bjornen for contributing to the Cults Totem. That redeemable has come to be associated with the Sharing Spotlight subseries that I do, talking about other TTRPGs beyond Daggerheart. And so I hope to get around to another one of those soon. I've done one on Fabula Ultima, which has a very successful Kickstarter going right now for a new edition of their core 4 books, as well as a bestiary, and then a cool new edition, a cool like hardcover edition of that bestiary. And I think just today, or maybe yesterday, they hit 1 million euros on the campaign, which is phenomenal. I'm so happy for them. I've only gotten to play Fabula Ultima once, but I've been listening to the Friends of the Table season Perpetua, where they're playing Fabula Ultima. I've picked up all 4 books. I think there's a lot of really fun stuff in there. In a world where I had either more time, but mostly a deeper well of executive function, where I could use more of the time that I have to do harder work, I would love to do some more designing for Fabula Ultima, or some designing. I haven't really done any designing for it in specific that isn't reading the books and then having thoughts about what I think is cool. So I am going to switch this over to me and scroll through the adventure a little bit more and see what else I want to talk about. Okay. The other thing I want to talk about is the idea of boss design. So in Daggerheart, there are a number of adversary types, and one of the adversary types is the solo. And as expressed in the core rulebook, the solo I think of as, here is an adversary that is big enough that they themselves represent a meaningful threat to a party, even if you include other adversaries to round out the group, right? A solo, if you're using the battle point system, is only 5 points. And if you use multiple solos, then it's extra because there's a whole system. But if you're using the battle point system, no one solo is actually going to be the only adversary you use in a scene if you're using your full battle points allotment for that given encounter. What I wanted for one of the scenes in Voice of the Swarm was an enemy that maybe can summon some minions, but is a arc-ending, climactic, individual threat. So, is their type solo? Do I introduce a new adversary type that is boss or super solo or something else, right? There's something important to the naming of it, because if I find a great name and present an adversary in this fashion in a way that a lot of people like, this idea might catch on. It may not be necessary for there to be a separate term. If I write and talk about it as a boss encounter, a lot of people will understand what I mean there without me needing to go to the level of I am adding to the taxonomy of how adversaries are talked about for Daggerheart with my Daggerheart compatible material that I hope people will either take and build on or integrate for their own works that they do. To what degree this catches, like what I'm trying to do, catches on and becomes a thing is kind of like maybe less important than some other things that I'm trying to do, right? If I want one thing from this adventure to catch on, I want the idea of archetype design to catch on, because I think it is probably the biggest thing I have come up with so far that for me is important to make longer form adventures, or adventures that are not written to be like, this is a tutorial or this is a convention game. Make those work so that Daggerheart sings to the maximum, to the best of its capability. And again, this is all just my opinion and perspective on things. This boss encounter is meant to be something that, like, it might take a whole session, right? It might take 2.5, 3 hours to do this one fight. And I want that fight the whole time through to feel exciting and to never become a slog. So that is a bit of a task, right? Any scene that goes on beyond 60 minutes, 90 minutes, that's a long scene. Now, you might treat something like this as multiple scenes because, spoilers, there's a phase change, right? It's a multi-phase boss, like in Dark Souls or a lot of other games that have multi-phase bosses. So that creates a natural turning point in the scene. What I want is other material in the features, environments, or other elements of how I write that encounter that create those turning points so that the overall fight against this being stays fresh and exciting and is going to be really memorable. For this, I looked at and spent a lot of time thinking about a fight from the Age of Umbra campaign. So I'm going to talk about something from Age of Umbra episode 2. I've talked about this before, but I'm just giving you forewarning. In that episode, the group fights Velk the Forsaken. Velk was designed by GM Matt Mercer, who is also an additional designer on Daggerheart, to be a really significant threat, such that that one character could take on 5 player characters. The one adversary could take on 5 player characters and be a terrifying threat the whole time through and keep the fight interesting. I think that fight was really well done, from how the adversary was designed to how the player characters engaged with it to how Matt as a GM responded to some of the improvisation that the players utilized. I think it's a great sequence. I tried to draw some influence and inspiration from that in a few ways, including for this adversary, allowing there to be a fear-generating loop, all within the features of one adversary. That being, this adversary has Relentless 2, where they can be activated up to 2 times in a GM turn, and they have Momentum, which is a feature that says when this adversary succeeds on an attack, you gain a fear. And what that means is Velk gets the spotlight. Velk attacks a player character, hits them. GM gains a fear. GM spends that fear immediately to get to attack with Velk again. Velk hits, gain a fear. The character has attacked twice, and if the move that prompted their first attack was one that was generated by a roll, the GM ends that GM turn with one more fear than they started it, right? They have 10, they hit, they go up to 11. They spend to do another attack, they hit, they go up to 11 again. They started the move, the GM turn with 10, they end with 11, if you land both of those hits. Additionally, not every time that you spotlight an adversary is going to generate an attack. And I think that is going to be one of the ways that you can keep a scene exciting, is that you don't let it devolve into you attack, they attack, you attack, they attack, you attack, they attack. For one, we want to try and we begin and end with the fiction. So we're not just saying Velk attacks. It is Velk lifts the great stone sword and swings it around like a whirlwind, trying to slash all 4 of you within range. And then I roll, and then I interpret the result, returning it to the fiction, so that we're not just looking down at our dice the whole time. We're looking at each other. We are telling the story, right? Velk misses on an attack, and I say, Velk hit everybody else but not you. What were you able to do to avoid this attack? Right? We're engaging, we're going back and forth. We are generating more fiction, which is going to be more memorable than if we only really stay with the dice and don't express what those results are and what the intentions generating the rolls are into fiction for one another. This is, again, just my opinion. Having a variety of actions or other features that a boss adversary can do gives them kind of like an attack pattern, right? If we're thinking in terms of how bosses in video games are designed, which I think is a great place to go for what I'm thinking about here. What makes a memorable boss fight? A cool area that you're fighting in, that could be expressed with a environment stat block, right? I'm playing a lot of Silksong right now. So there are some boss arenas where the space itself is something that you engage with or that creates challenges or threats. Those would be environment features. Right now, I have an environment for phase 2 of this fight, and I don't have one for phase 1, and that is something I'm looking to change, which may involve changing or it's going to involve changing what I have in terms of my write-up of this is where you encounter this boss, right? I'm going to return to my kind of whiteboard moment and go, okay, what would be a cool and engaging place to have this fight happen? How can I make it so that the fight is almost certainly going to happen there? And then what are the interesting things in that space that I can express through environment features that are going to synergize with how this boss adversary is written, right? It makes the things the boss can do scarier, or does things the boss can't do to be able to present threats in a wider range or that come at the characters in different ways. How does the space keep the characters from moving the fight? Not to make it impossible to move the fight, but to make it harder, because as the adventure writer, I don't want to write, here's 4 different places you might fight this boss. I want to say, you find the boss here. And then if you want to move the fight, succeeding probably should feel like it was a challenge. And to make it a challenge, I might think about ways that the environment or the adversary keeps you in the space where you find this boss. The other thing that I want to think about when I'm designing objectives or designing scenes or situations in a adventure, especially if there's a combat, is what are the objectives of the adversaries in the scene? What are the likely objectives of the player characters? And how can the scene include pressure on or tensions related to those objectives so that the given scene is not just kill or be killed? For the boss fight, there is a moment where the fight becomes a chase. The character's objective may still be kill this enemy, but the enemy's objective is no longer kill these player characters. It is move or get away. And so that change in apparent objective, and in reality, what the adversary is actively trying to do, that is its own form of dynamism, right? You're fighting the adversary, they're fighting you, you're just trying to fight to the death, and then something changes and the adversary says, no, screw this, and runs. That's a change. That is a narrative beat that shifts the scene. If you go in and you have a clear sense of what the adversary's objective is, and it is contra to what the player characters are doing, but it's like orthogonal, or it's like it contradicts, but is not just a single line where A pushes this way and B pushes the other way. If it's like this, right? If there's like torsion. Anyway, I'm getting lost in the sauce in terms of spatiality. I'm trying to have that variety. Vita Bjornen says, one of my adversaries has a custom feature called Your Hope is Mine, where if they make a successful attack, the player loses a hope and he gains a fear. Yeah, that to me feels similar to the terrifying feature from the core book / the SRD, but I love personalizing it to the character because adversary features make great lines for speaking adversaries. And even if you don't speak the line in character, you can announce the line as the GM, and if it's evocative, that's going to add to the player's experience of the scene. So it's just after, or it's almost 2:10, and about an hour is kind of where I'm looking to have most of these streams be. I am going to grab the link to the Dungeons of Drakkenheim Daggerheart campaign again and put it into the chat. This is a reminder, if you have not already gone to take a look at this page, that I would invite you and ask you to go and check this page out. I am the lead designer on this project, working with the Dungeon Dudes, which has been really fun. This campaign is going to be on Kickstarter. It's going to be in November. But if you go to that page now and save it or kind of click follow, you will get any updates that are sent out before the campaign goes live, and you will be reminded when the campaign goes live so that you can check it out, be one of the first backers if you're excited or interested in doing so, and there are some community stretch goals. If this campaign gets 1,500 followers before it goes live, added to the things you can get in the campaign will be a really nice miniature of one of the characters from Drakenforce, which is the iconic player character group from the original Dungeons of Drakkenheim actual play. And then at 3,000 and then at 4,500 followers, the second and third, which is the final, of these characters are added as miniatures. Yes, I saw your note, Vita Bjorn, and I'll get to it when the stream is done. Thank you so much for sending that note. The thing about this campaign is the better this campaign does, the more a few things happen. And again, this is just my personal opinion. I'm not speaking for Ghostfire or Darrington or the Dungeon Dudes. If this campaign blows up in a big way, for me, that tells Darrington Press that there is a big demand for book-length Daggerheart related or Daggerheart compatible adventures, which I think there is demand for because I see a lot of people asking for it. It also says there is demand and interest in Daggerheart more broadly that isn't just the first few months of incredible sales, right? I think the game has been a big hit so far, and that is really cool and exciting and is a big part of why my streaming has gone as well as it has, thanks to folks like you who are watching live or on YouTube. Success for the campaign tells Ghostfire, the publisher, there's a lot of excitement about this project specifically, and that maybe makes more work for me, which I would like because it will help me pay my bills. It would give more flexibility and the potential to expand what this project looks like. I can't really go into details because I'm not going to be the one in charge of them. I might be the one working with Ghostfire to decide what that's going to be, but this is not the time for me to speculate on that or tip the hand. But the better the campaign does, I think the cooler the project can be because there'll be support for different things. And the better this does, the more I think other publishers will feel like it is worthwhile to look at creating Daggerheart compatible or Daggerheart related projects, whether that is in collaboration with Darrington or not. So that's my pitch for why I think that this campaign doing well is good for Daggerheart more broadly, even though I'm also wanting it to do well because I will benefit individually, right? I don't want to pretend like this is all altruism. I am excited about the project. I want to do more with the project. I think it's going to be really cool. I'm having a great time working on it so far. And so I would love for folks to go to the page and save it /pre-follow. And then I will talk more about it over the course of the next month. And then when it is live, I'll probably be talking about it a lot, including maybe some other places. While this is happening, I'm still working on Bastion of Hope. Right now, the main thing where we are is art and layout. And the process and collaboration of that has been really cool. That is easier for me to do alongside other stuff because the text is basically done. So don't worry, Bastion of Hope is still coming. I'm just at the point of balancing a few plates. And I think that's going to be it. So thank you to Not So Simpleton for redeeming some channel points. Hats off. It looks like the stream is being weird. I think there was an internet outage earlier today in my region, so apologies if any of this is garbled or laggy or something like that. So thank you to Not So Simpleton, Vita Bjornen, Pathfinder PhD. I'm just checking for all the people who have talked today. Okay. Everyone who is in chat, everybody who is watching live, and a special thanks to folks watching video on demand on YouTube or on Twitch. If you have liked this and you are here because of, because of Drakenheim, without necessarily knowing much about me before, welcome. Thank you for being here. And you can see other stuff that I'm doing to create Daggerheart compatible material and resources for Daggerheart at my Patreon, which is patreon.com/MichaelRUnderwood. Loose and Spookin', I'm sorry, we are just wrapping up. And hello, Magdalena. Yeah, I'm very curious to see what people do with this idea, whether it is resonating for them, how they're interpreting it, and things like that. So if you are using this approach or something like it in your own adventure design, I would love to hear about it. Please come and comment on this video on YouTube or over on Patreon to comment on anything related to that. I want this to be a thing so that it can be useful for everybody. I would love to be known as the person who cracked the code on it, because that would be pretty cool. But more importantly, I want creator communities for Daggerheart compatible material to feel like it is a viable and exciting thing to make adventures at different lengths for Daggerheart, and that they can do so in a way that is going to feel like it works with the game rather than working against the game or anything that is like less ideal. So that's that. Now I'm going to end the stream. Thank you so much to everybody for hanging out, and I will see you next week. Ending card.